June 19, 1944, 140 miles northwest of Guam. Lieutenant, junior grade, Alexander Vasu pressed his face to the canopy of his Grumman F6F Hellcat, staring in disbelief at the sight below. Spread out over the cobalt Pacific, glinting in the sun, was what he would later describe as a swarm of bees. 50 Japanese dive bombers, flying in tight, disciplined formation, were heading straight for Task Force 58. In the 8 minutes that followed, Vasu would down 6 enemy planes using only 360 rounds of ammunition, an astonishing average of 60 rounds per kill. When he landed back aboard the USS Lexington, still grinning and holding up 6 fingers for the photographers, he embodied a truth Japanese Naval Command was only beginning to face. The once elite corps of naval aviators, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor with surgical precision and driven the Allies from the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, no longer existed. What remained were young, barely trained boys, flying into what would soon be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Those young pilots diving toward the American fleet that morning had averaged only 200 hours of flight training earlier that year. By late 1944, many would graduate with fewer than 40 hours of actual flight time. Their American opponents, by contrast, had logged over 500 hours before ever entering combat. That single disparity in experience explained June 19th better than any tactical analysis ever could. Japan's fatal belief that quality could never be mass-produced was about to collide with American industrial reality. The Japanese had run out of skilled pilots, and everyone who looked up at the sky that day could see it. The crisis had been building since June 4, 1942, when 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk at Midway. In that single day, Japan lost 110 of its most experienced combat pilots, veterans who had perfected their skills over China and led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Those thousands of cumulative flight hours could never be replaced. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had around 3,500 trained pilots, of which only 1,500 to 1,750 were carrier qualified. Their training system, bound by rigid pre-war standards, was never meant to sustain heavy wartime losses. Before Pearl Harbor, acceptance into Japan's naval flight program was almost impossibly competitive. Of roughly 1,500 applicants in 1937, only 70 were admitted, and of those, just 25 graduated. Training took years. By 1941, a typical naval aviator completing the program had accumulated between 600 and 800 hours of flight time over as long as 4 years. They practiced formation flying until it became instinct, drilled aerial gunnery until aiming felt like reflex, and learned oceanic navigation with only compass, chronometer, and dead reckoning. By the time they joined operational squadrons, they were among the finest pilots in the world. But excellence came at the cost of scale. Japan's entire pilot training system could only produce a few hundred aviators per year, never enough to replace the losses sustained in an all-out global war. Pre-war planners had never imagined losing hundreds of pilots in a single battle, much less month after month. Japanese doctrine envisioned one decisive naval engagement that would crush the enemy fleet and end the war. Accordingly, pilot training was built on quality over quantity, on elite individual mastery rather than mass production. The Americans had taken the opposite approach. Even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had been expanding its training programs. The Civilian Pilot Training Program, launched in 1939, created a large pool of men with basic flight experience who could be rapidly advanced into military training. When war came, the U.S. could draw from this reservoir while building training bases at a pace that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 20,000 naval aviators annually, 20,142 that year alone. Pilot training had become an 18-month assembly line process that moved cadets through primary, intermediate, and advanced phases with near-factory precision. Airfields like Naval Air Station Pensacola and countless others processed thousands of trainees. Experienced combat pilots were rotated back to serve as instructors, bringing hard-earned lessons from the front into every classroom and flight deck. This system didn't just produce pilots, it produced them in vast numbers, fast enough to absorb devastating losses and still maintain combat strength. Japan tried to adapt, but faced crippling limitations. Fuel shortages became acute after 1942 as American submarines cut off tanker routes from the southern resource zone. Flight training consumes immense quantities of aviation gasoline, and as supplies dwindled, training hours were slashed. By 1943, Japanese cadets graduated with about 500 hours of flight time. By early 1944, that number had fallen to 200. By late 1944, many finished with only 40 hours in actual aircraft. Some would end the war with barely 90 total hours logged. The decline in quality accelerated every month. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third-highest ace, credited with 64 victories, became a flight instructor in early 1943 after being wounded and partially blinded in one eye. What he found among the new trainees alarmed him. In his memoirs, he described students as undisciplined, careless, and overconfident despite their lack of skill. Flight training accidents became daily events. Fire trucks and ambulances were a constant presence, rushing to the ends of runways to rescue cadets from wrecked aircraft after clumsy landings or botched takeoffs. The desperate shift toward quantity over quality meant that undertrained pilots were being sent into combat against opponents who had double or triple their experience. The contrast was staggering. Pre-war Japanese pilots averaged around 700 hours before their first mission. American pilots in 1944 averaged 500. By comparison, new Japanese aviators entering combat in early 1944 had about 200, and by late 1944, some had fewer than 40 hours total. The difference was not just dramatic, it was fatal. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was triggered by the American landings on Saipan on June 15, 1944. For Japan, the Marianas represented the inner line of defense, and Saipan lay just 200 nautical miles south of Tokyo. B-29 superfortresses operating from Saipan could reach the Japanese home islands with full bomb loads. Admiral Sotoyota, commanding the combined fleet, recognized that if the Americans secured Saipan, strategic bombing would devastate Japanese cities and war production. The fate of the empire, he declared, rests on this one battle. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa commanded the first mobile fleet from his flagship Taiho, the newest and most heavily armored carrier in the Japanese infantry. Ozawa deployed 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, and 6 light carriers carrying approximately 130 to 450 aircraft. His plan relied on Operation AO, which presumed that Japanese carriers operating from longer range could strike American forces while remaining outside the range of American carrier aircraft. Land-based aircraft from Guam and other islands would coordinate with carrier strikes to overwhelm the American fleet. Japanese pilots, Ozawa believed, remained superior to their American counterparts despite the losses at Midway and in the Solomons campaign. Ozawa was tragically mistaken about pilot quality. The veterans who had trained for years before Pearl Harbor were largely dead. What remained were replacement pilots with minimal training facing the most comprehensive pilot training program ever developed. The mathematical reality was brutal. When Japanese pilots with 200 hours of training engaged American pilots with 500 hours of training, the outcome was predetermined. Add to this the American technological advantages in radar-directed fighter control, the proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that detonated within 70 ft of their targets, an aircraft like the F6F Hellcat that were specifically designed to counter the Zero, and the result approached massacre. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell commanded Task Force 58 from the carrier USS Lexington. Under his command were 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers carrying approximately 95 aircraft. These carriers were screened by 7 fast battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, and 58 destroyers. It was the most powerful naval formation ever assembled. Every ship bristled with radar antennas. Every fighter pilot had been trained to work with fighter directors who used radar to vector them precisely onto incoming enemy formations. The organization worked like a factory assembly line, identifying targets, directing interceptors, and destroying enemy aircraft with industrial efficiency. On the morning of June 19th, American radar detected the first Japanese strike 75 miles out. Fighter directors aboard USS Lexington immediately began vectoring Hellcat fighters to intercept positions. The Japanese formation consisted of 69 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters flying in loose formation at varying altitudes. They were met 40 mi from the carriers by over 220 F6F Hellcats. The slaughter began immediately. American pilots described the combat as effortless. Japanese formations broke apart under the first attacks. Inexperienced pilots made elementary mistakes, turning into attacks instead of away, failing to maintain defensive formations, losing situational awareness in the chaos of combat. Veteran American pilots recognized immediately that these were not the skilled opponents they had faced 2 years earlier. These were students flying into their first and last combat. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vasu had already shot down 12 enemy aircraft in previous engagements, flying from USS Lexington as part of Fighting Squadron 16. He had learned his trade under Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, himself a Medal of Honor recipient who had been killed in action 5 months earlier. O'Hare had taught VCU the high side pass for attacking bombers, how to aim for the wing route where fuel tanks concentrated, how to use short-controlled bursts rather than spray ammunition wildly. VCU had absorbed every lesson. On the morning of June 19th, Vu was flying combat air patrol when he spotted the second Japanese strike wave approaching. He counted approximately 50 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers in a loose formation below his altitude. They were heading straight for the carrier task force. Despite his malfunctioning supercharger that limited his altitude capability and caused oil to mist across his windshield, Vasu rolled into his attack. What followed became legendary. Vasu described seeing the dive bombers spread out like a swarm of bees against the blue water. He maneuvered behind the first bomber and fired a short burst at the wing root and cockpit area. The dive bomber exploded and fell away. He shifted to the second target. Another short burst, another kill. The third, fourth, and fifth followed in rapid succession. Japanese pilots seemed unaware of the danger behind them. They held formation, making no evasive maneuvers, presenting perfect targets. The sixth kill came with dramatic violence. Vasu fired into the dive bomber and must have hit its bomb load. The aircraft exploded with tremendous force directly in front of his Hellcat. Vasu yanked the stick up sharply to avoid flying through the debris. Scattered pieces of the destroyed bomber tumbled past his canopy. In exactly 8 minutes, Vasu had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft using precisely 60 rounds per kill, demonstrating the extraordinary ammunition efficiency that marked elite pilots. When VCU landed back on Lexington, ordnancemen discovered he'd fired only 360 rounds from his Hellcat's 2,400-round ammunition capacity. He had averaged less than 5 seconds of firing time per kill. As he climbed from his cockpit, grinning widely, he spotted Vice Admiral Mitchell on the carrier's bridge. Vasu held up 6 gloved fingers to indicate his score. Mitchell smiled back. A photographer captured the moment, and the image became one of the iconic photographs of American victory in the Pacific. But Vasu's success was not unique that all day. It was merely the most photographed example of what was happening across the entire battle space. Hellcat pilots from every carrier in Task Force 58 were racking up similar scores. The Japanese were not just being defeated, they were being annihilated. The first Japanese strike wave of 69 aircraft suffered devastating losses. Only 27 aircraft returned to their carriers. 42 aircraft, more than 60% of the strike force, were destroyed. The second wave launched by Ozawa consisted of 109 aircraft. They fared no better. American Hellcats tore through the formation. Only 31 aircraft from the second wave returned. 78 aircraft lost. The third wave of 47 aircraft was misdirected, and many planes ran out of fuel searching for the American fleet. Only 7 aircraft from this wave survived. The fourth wave of 87 aircraft launched in the afternoon met similar fate. 30 were shot down over Guam by Hellcats patrolling the island. Their remainder attacked the southernmost American carrier group, but inflicted no damage while losing most of their number to anti-aircraft fire and fighters. By the end of June 19th, the Japanese had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 waves. Only 130 aircraft returned. 243 carrier aircraft were destroyed in a single day of combat. American losses on June 19th were 23 aircraft. The kill ratio approached 11-1. Japanese pilots who survived described the combat as hopeless. American fighters seemed to be everywhere. Japanese aircraft that penetrated to the carrier screen were met by a curtain of anti-aircraft fire so intense that survival was impossible. The proximity-fused shells detonated within 70 ft of aircraft, filling the sky with lethal shrapnel that shredded aircraft structures and killed pilots before they could press their attacks. While the air battle raged, American submarines struck devastating blows below the surface. At 8:10 a.m., the American submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, fired 6 torpedoes at the Japanese carrier Taiho. Blanchard had maneuvered into an ideal attack position inside the Japanese formation when his fire control computer failed. Forced to fire by eye, he launched all 6 torpedoes in a spread pattern to maximize hit probability. Japanese warrant officer Sakio Komatsu had just launched from Taihaho when he spotted a torpedo wake heading directly toward his carrier. Without hesitation, Komatsu deliberately dove his aircraft into the torpedo's path. The explosion destroyed both the torpedo and Komatsu's aircraft, but his sacrifice saved Taiho from 1 hit. 5 torpedoes remained in the water. 4 missed astern. 1 struck Taiho on the starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks. Initially, the damage appeared minor. Taihaho's speed decreased by only 1 knot. The forward elevator jammed in the up position, but flight operations continued. The carrier resumed launching and recovering aircraft. Captain Kikuchi Tomo believed his ship could continue operations despite the damage. What he did not realize was that aviation gasoline was leaking from the ruptured tanks and filling the hangar decks with explosive vapor. The damage control response proved catastrophically incompetent. An inexperienced damage control officer attempting to disperse the gasoline fumes opened all ventilation systems throughout the ship. Instead of venting the vapors overboard, this action spread them throughout Taiho's interior spaces. For 5 hours, gasoline vapor accumulated in concentrations that approached the explosive threshold. At approximately 2:30 p.m., someone threw a switch or struck a spark. The accumulated vapors detonated with catastrophic force. Massive explosions ripped through Taihaho from bow to stern. The armored flight deck, designed to withstand bomb hits, bulged upward from the force of the internal blasts. Secondary explosions followed as aviation fuel ignited and munitions cooked off. Admiral Ozawa, recognizing his flagship was doomed, transferred his command staff to the heavy cruiser Haguro. At 4:28 p.m., Taiho rolled over and sank, taking 1660 men to the bottom. A single torpedo hit, combined with incompetent damage control, had destroyed Japan's newest and most powerful carrier. 3 hours after Albacore struck Taiho, A second American submarine attacked. At 11:18 a.m., USS Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kosler, fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku from 200 Whiters, Swaidi's range. Kosler had maneuvered his submarine into a perfect firing position while Shokaku was recovering aircraft. 3 to 4 torpedoes struck Shokaku's starboard side in 8-second intervals. One hit near the forward bomb magazines and aviation gasoline storage tanks. The damage was immediately catastrophic. Fires erupted throughout the carrier as aviation fuel ignited. Shokaku had been a veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and the Santa Cruz Islands. She had survived damage in previous battles, but the torpedo hits on June 19th struck in the worst possible locations. At 2:08 p.m., 4 hours after the torpedo hits, an aerial bomb stored in the forward hangar exploded. The blast triggered sympathetic detonations in nearby munitions. Massive explosions tore through the forward section of the ship. Minutes later, at 2:12 p.m., Shokaku went vertical, her bow plunging toward the bottom while her stern rose high above the waves. The crew that had assembled on the aft flight deck slid forward into the blazing elevator pit as the ship stood on end. Shokaku sank stern first. Of 2,150 crew members, 1,263 died, including 376 men. Of Air Group 61, 2 of Japan's most powerful carriers had been destroyed in a single day by submarine attacks that the Japanese screening forces had failed to prevent. The destruction of Taiho and Shokaku, combined with the annihilation of over 240 carrier aircraft, effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. Ozawa still had 7 operational carriers, but he had fewer than 100 operational aircraft remaining. More critically, he had lost most of his trained pilots. The few who survived were demoralized and exhausted. They had witnessed the methodical destruction of their comrades by an enemy who seemed invincible. Admiral Raymond Spruant, commanding the Fifth Fleet, made the controversial decision not to pursue Ozawa's retreating force aggressively during the night of June 19th. Spruant's primary mission was to protect the invasion force at Saipan. He remembered Midway, where American carriers had been caught by surprise and nearly destroyed. He chose to maintain position between Ozawa and Saipan, rather than pursue into unknown waters at night. This decision has been debated ever since. Critics argue that more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed the entire Japanese carrier force. Defenders note that Spruant accomplished his mission. The invasion fleet remained protected, and Japan's carrier aviation was effectively destroyed, regardless of whether the carriers themselves were sunk. On June 20th, Mitchell launched a long-range strike against the retreating Japanese fleet. At approximately 4:20 p.m., 216 American aircraft launched from Task Force 58 carriers. Knowing they would have to return after dark, the strike force traveled 275 kilometers to reach the Japanese fleet near the limit of their combat radius. They sank the carrier Hound, damaged several other vessels. 80 American aircraft were lost in the mission, primarily from fuel exhaustion during the night recovery operations rather than enemy action. Pilots who ran out of fuel ditched in the ocean, trusting that rescue operations would find them. Most were recovered. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented a decisive turning point. Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft over 2 days. 3 carriers were sunk. More critically, Japan lost most of its remaining trained carrier pilots. Subsequent battles would see Japanese carriers present, but unable to conduct effective operations due to lack of qualified air crews. At later Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers served primarily as decoys because they had so few trained pilots that carrier operations were no longer viable. The decisive battle Japanese doctrine had anticipated 4 decades had occurred, and Japan had lost catastrophically. The young Americans who flew from Task Force 58 on June 19th represented something unprecedented in military history. They were products of industrial-age total war, mass-reduced warriors created through standardized training programs scaled to volumes that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. They were individually competent rather than exceptionally skilled. But there were so many of them, so well equipped, so thoroughly supported by industrial production, that individual skill gaps became irrelevant. The training infrastructure replaced losses faster than combat could inflict them. Experienced pilots rotated into teaching billets to keep instruction current. Combat lessons were incorporated into training doctrine within weeks. This approach worked because it was designed from the first day to operate at the scale modern warfare demanded. The Japanese pilots who died over the Philippine Sea were victims of strategic decisions made years before the battle. They were brave. They were committed. Many showed individual courage that deserved respect. But they were products of a deal training philosophy that had worked brilliantly for 50 years, but had become obsolete the moment sustained combat began producing casualties faster than the program could replace them with equivalent quality. No amount of courage could compensate for insufficient training. No amount of dedication could overcome the simple reality that 40 to 200 flight hours did not produce pilots capable of matching opponents with 500 hours. The Grumman F6F Hellcat proved itself as perhaps the most successful fighter aircraft of the Pacific War. Powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-28,000 engine, the Hellcat could reach speeds of 318 mph and had a combat radius of 310 mph. Armed with 650 caliber machine guns carrying 2,400 rounds total, it could deliver devastating firepower. The Hellcat was rugged, could absorb significant battle damage, and continue flying, and was designed specifically to counter the Zero's advantages in maneuverability by emphasizing speed, armor protection, and firepower. The Hellcat would account for 75% of U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific War and achieved an overall kill ratio of 19-1. Against the Zero specifically, the Hellcat's kill ratio was 13-1. The Mitsubishi A6M0, which had dominated the early years of the Pacific War, was by 1944 essentially obsolete. Powered by an approximately 1,000-horsepower Nakajima Sake engine, Suri feeder Bentrividursiknad, the Zero had excellent range, approximately 600 mph combat radius, and superb maneuverability. Armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, it could deliver lethal firepower. But the Zero's advantages came at a cost. It lacked armor protection for the pilot. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. Any hit that penetrated to fuel tanks or pilot would likely prove fatal. Against well-trained opponents in rugged aircraft like the Hellcat, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. More critically, by June 1944, there were no longer pilots capable of exploiting the Zero's performance characteristics. The Japanese had some of the finest aircraft designers in the world. New designs like the Kawanishi N1K Shedden offered performance superior to the Hellcat. But these aircraft entered service too late and in too few numbers. More importantly, there were no longer pilots trained to fly them effectively. The aircraft existed. The pilots did not. Alexander Vasu would shoot down his 19th and final aircraft on June 20th during the strike against Ozawa's fleet, making him the Navy's leading ace at that moment. Though he would hold that title for only 4 months, as other pilots surpassed his total, he was nominated for the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but received the Navy Cross instead. In August 1944, he returned to the United States for a war bond. Tour and married Catherine Horn on August 24th. He spent several months promoting war bonds and working with Grumman aircraft on fighter development before insisting on returning to combat. In December 1944, flying with Fighting Squadron 20 from USS Lexington, Vatsu was shot down by anti-aircraft fire over the Philippines during his second combat mission after returning to the Pacific. He parachuted safely and was rescued by Filipino guerrilla fighters who appointed him commander of a guerrilla unit of approximately 180 men. Vasu spent 5 weeks moving through Japanese-occupied territory with his guerrilla force before making contact with American forces in January 1945. He returned to USS Lexington carrying a Japanese sword given to him by the guerrillas and leading his unit into American lines. Vasco spent the final months of the war as a test pilot at the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. He ended World War II as the U.S. Navy's fourth-ranking ace with 19 aerial victories and 21 aircraft destroyed on the ground. After the war, he was promoted to lieutenant commander and served 6 years as a test pilot. He was instrumental in forming the post-war Naval and Marine Air Reserve program. He commanded Fighting Squadron 51 from 1956 to 1958, winning the Navy's individual gunnery championship in 1957. He retired from the Navy with the rank of commander on December 31, 1963. After retirement, Vasio moved to Danville, California, and worked for Wells Fargo Bank. His life and career were chronicled in Ray Boomhau's 2010 book, Fighter Pilot: The World War II Career of Alex Vasu. Vasu attended reunions of Pacific War veterans and spoke at military events throughout his later life. He died on January 29, 2015, at the age of 96, long enough to see his famous photograph from June 19, 1944, recognized as one of the iconic images of American victory in the Pacific. But Vasio always insisted that June 19th was not about individual heroics. It was about competing philosophies of warfare, America's industrial model overwhelming Japan's artisan approach. In numerous interviews over the decades, he emphasized that he had simply done his job. The real story, he believed, was the industrial capacity that produced Hellcats by the thousands, trained pilots by the tens of thousands, and created the logistical infrastructure that kept carriers supplied with fuel, ammunition, and aircraft halfway across the Pacific Ocean. The statistics from the Battle of the Philippine Sea tell the mathematical story with brutal clarity. Task Force 58 deployed approximately 900 aircraft flown by pilots averaging over 500 flight hours. Japanese carriers launched approximately 430 aircraft flown by pilots averaging under 250 flight hours in early 1944, with many late 1944 pilots having only 40 hours. American pilots claimed over 380 Japanese aircraft destroyed on June 19th alone. Japanese pilots claimed to have destroyed over 100 American aircraft. The actual American losses were 23. The disparity between Japanese perception and reality demonstrated how completely Japanese pilots had lost situational awareness in combat. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots who survived knew they were outmatched. They knew their training was inadequate. They knew they were being sent to die against opponents they could not defeat. Morale collapsed throughout Japanese naval aviation. Some pilots developed psychosomatic illnesses to avoid combat duty. Others flew their assigned missions but avoided engagement whenever possible, returning to report enemy contact but accomplishing nothing. The fighting spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation in 1941 and 1942 was gone, replaced by resignation and despair. By 1945, Japan was reduced to housing inexperienced pilots in kamikaze attacks because no other form of aerial combat remained viable. The kamikaze was not a cultural choice reflecting Japanese martial spirit. It was an admission that Japanese pilot training had failed so completely that pilots could no longer be trained to return from missions. Training someone to fly an airplane into a ship required only a few weeks. Training someone to be a combat pilot required months or years that Japan no longer had. Japan's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Training facilities were being bombed. Experienced instructors were dead or flying combat missions. The training pipeline had completely collapsed. The final irony was that Japan possessed the industrial capacity to build excellent aircraft, but lacked the capacity to train pilots to fly them. The Kawanishi N-1K Shiden that entered service in late 1944 was in many respects superior to the F6F Hellcat. It was faster, more maneuverable, and carried heavier armament. But it entered service too late and in numbers too small to affect the war's outcome. More critically, the few Shidans that reached operational squadrons were flown by pilots with minimal training who could not exploit the aircraft's capabilities. Superior technology meant nothing without trained operators. American pilots who survived June 19th went on to dominate Pacific skies for the remainder of the war. They struck targets across the Philippines, Formosa, Okinawa, and eventually Japan itself. They faced increasing desperation from Japanese forces, but decreasing competence from Japanese pilots. By 1945, American carrier pilots described shooting down Japanese aircraft as little more than target practice. The opposition had no skills, no tactics, no hope. They flew because they were ordered to fly, and they died because they lacked the training to survive combat against opponents who had everything they lacked. The battle had lasted less than 10 hours of actual aerial combat on June 19th. Its consequences would shape their remainder of the Pacific. War. Japan never again contested American naval aviation dominance. The carrier forces that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, that had represented Japanese hopes for victory through superior skill and courage, had been destroyed not by American courage or superior individual skill, but by American industrial capacity applied to mass training programs. The Turkey Shoot was not won by ace pilots making brilliant individual decisions. It was won by adequate pilots following standardized procedures, supported by superior equipment, enabled by training programs that could produce replacements faster than combat could destroy them. Vasu's 6 kills in 8 minutes represented exceptional performance within a framework designed to generate consistent results. Other pilots scored 3 kills, 4 kills, 5 kills that day. The cumulative effect was the same. Japanese naval aviation was destroyed as an offensive force. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vasu, holding up 6 fingers on the deck of the Lexington, remains the enduring image of June 19, 1944. But the larger story was playing out in training facilities across America, where thousands more pilots just like Vasu were learning the skills that would carry them through combat. The larger story was in the wreckage of Japanese training programs that could no longer produce pilots fast enough or well enough to matter. The larger story was in the mathematics of attrition, where American pilot production exceeded American pilot losses, while Japanese pilot losses exceeded Japanese pilot production by margins that made victory impossible. The human cost of the Battle of the Philippine Sea extended far beyond the pilots lost in combat. Aboard Taiho, 1660 men died when the carrier exploded and sank. Most were trapped below decks when the catastrophic explosions tore through the ship. There was no time to abandon ship properly. Men who reached the flight deck found themselves thrown into the water as the carrier rolled over. Many were pulled down by the suction as 33,000 tons of steel plunged toward the ocean floor. Destroyers rescued approximately 500 survivors from the water, but over 200 men went down with the ship. Aboard Shukaku, the casualties were equally horrific. 1,263 men died out of a crew of 2,150. The carrier sank so quickly after the final explosions that organized abandonment was impossible. Crew members assembled on the aft flight deck found themselves sliding forward into the blazing elevator pit as the ship went vertical. Those who jumped into the water faced burning fuel oil spreading across the surface. Some men survived, the sinking only to die from their injuries or exposure before rescue ships could reach them. The survivors who were picked up by destroyers had witnessed the violent death of one of Japan's most famous warships, a carrier that had participated in nearly every major battle of the Pacific War until that day. The loss of so many experienced sailors compounded Japan's problems. Naval aviators received attention, but the ship's crews, who maintained aircraft, operated radar and communications equipment, handled damage control, and managed flight operations were equally irreplaceable. These men had years of experience. They knew their ships intimately. They worked together as teams that functioned with the efficiency that only comes from long practice. When Taiho and Shukaku sank, Japan lost not only the carriers themselves, but the institutional knowledge embodied in their crews. Replacement crews on other carriers would lack this experience, making operations less efficient and more prone to accidents. The American submarine force that had sunk Taiho and Shokaku represented another dimension of American industrial and tactical superiority. USS Al-Bakr and USS Kavala were Gato-class submarines, part of a production run that would eventually total 77 boats. These submarines displaced 15 to 25 tons surfaced, carried crews of 60 to 80 men, and were armed with 10 21-in torpedo tubes. They could dive to depths of 300 ft and remain submerged for extended periods. Their diesel-electric propulsion systems gave them surface speeds of 20 knots and submerged speeds of 9 knots. More importantly, American submarines operated as part of an integrated intelligence and logistics network that Japanese anti-submarine forces could rarely match. Ultra-intercepts provided American submarines with advanced warning of Japanese fleet movements. Long-range patrol aircraft spotted Japanese formations and radioed positions to submarines. Submarine tender ships provided fuel torpedoes and supplies at forward bases, allowing submarines to remain on station for extended periods. The entire infrastructure worked with industrial efficiency, positioning submarines where they could inflict maximum damage on Japanese naval forces. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities had improved since the early war years, but remained inadequate to protect high-value targets like carriers. Destroyers carried depth charges and could conduct sonar searches, but lacked the persistence and coordination to effectively screen carrier formations against skilled submarine commanders. The destroyers escorting Taiho dropped depth charges on USS Al-Bakr after the attack, but caused only minor damage. The destroyers escorting Shokaku pounded USS Kavala with 105 depth charge explosions over 3 hours, but failed to sink or even seriously damage the submarine. Both submarines escaped and continued, their patrols with Al-Bakr going on to complete her mission, and Kavala remaining on station until ordered home in late July. The failure of Japanese screening force to protect carriers from submarine attack reflected broader problems in Japanese anti-submarine warfare. Japan had entered the war focused on offensive operations, carrier strikes, and surface combat. Defensive operations like convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare received minimal attention and resources. This proved catastrophic, as American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping throughout the war. By June 1944, American submarines had sunk millions of tons of Japanese merchant shipping, crippling Japan's ability to import raw materials from occupied territories and distribute resources within the home islands. The parallels between Japanese failures in anti-submarine warfare and failures in pilot training were obvious. Both reflected a focus on offensive operations and individual excellence at the expense of the unglamorous but essential support functions that modern warfare demanded. Japan trained superbatic pilots, but failed to train adequate numbers of transport pilots, maintenance personnel, and logistics specialists. Japan built powerful battleships and carriers, but failed to build enough convoy escorts, oilers, and repair ships. The pattern repeated across every dimension of Japanese military operations, and the cumulative effect was decisive. Task Force 58's operations after the Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the confidence American forces had gained. The carriers continued supporting the Saipan invasion through June and into July, launching strikes against Japanese positions on the island and providing air cover for ground forces. American pilots flew combat air patrols, close-air support missions, and strikes against Japanese reinforcements with casual efficiency. Opposition was minimal. Japanese air power in the Marianas had been effectively destroyed. In July 1944, Task Force 58 struck targets across the western Pacific. Carriers launched raids against the Bonan Islands, Ewoima, and Guam. They supported the invasions of Guam and Tinian. They interdicted Japanese shipping and struck airfields from which Japanese bombers might threaten American forces. The carriers operated with virtual impunity. Japanese air attacks were rare and ineffective. The few Japanese aircraft that did attack were easily shot down by combat air patrols or anti-aircraft fire. The organized destruction of Japanese air power continued through the fall of 1944. During the invasion of the Philippines in October, American carriers again faced Japanese opposition. But the pattern established at the Battle of the Philippine Sea repeated. Japanese pilots were poorly trained, poorly coordinated, and unable to penetrate American defenses effectively. The Battle of Lee Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, saw Japanese carriers present but unable to conduct offensive operations due to lack of trained pilots. The carriers served as decoys, deliberately sacrificing themselves to draw American forces away from the landing beaches. It was a mission that admitted defeat, using carriers as expendable bait because they could no longer function as offensive weapons. The kamikaze attacks that emerged during the Philippines campaign represented Japan's final admission that conventional naval aviation was no longer viable. If pilots could not be trained to fight and return, they would be trained to die attacking their targets. Kamikaze tactics inflicted significant damage on American forces, sinking dozens of ships and damaging hundreds more. But kamikaze attacks were fundamentally defensive attempts to make invasion so costly that Americans would negotiate rather than continue advancing. They could not win the war. They could only increase the price Americans paid for victory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot fundamentally changed how military planners thought about air combat. The battle demonstrated that numerical and technological advantages combined with superior training could produce results that approached annihilation. The 11-to-1 kill ratio on June 19th was unprecedented in modern warfare. It suggested that with sufficient advantages in training, equipment, and tactical organization, one side could achieve air superiority so complete that the enemy ceased to be a meaningful factor. This lesson would influence air combat doctrine for decades. The importance of radar-directed fighter control became obvious. The value of rugged, heavily armed fighters over nimble but fragile opponents was confirmed. The necessity of comprehensive training programs that produced pilots in large numbers became clear. Nations that learned these lessons would dominate air combat in subsequent conflicts. Nations that ignored these lessons would repeat Japan's mistakes. The Battle of the Philippine Sea also demonstrated the importance of integrated naval operations. American success on June 19th came from the coordination of carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, radar installations, communications networks, and logistics support. No single element won the battle. The integrated force won the battle. Japanese forces organized around carrier striking power with inadequate support functions could not match American coordinated operations even when individual Japanese ships or aircraft performed well. The human dimension of the battle deserves emphasis. The young Japanese pilots who died on June 19th were not monsters or fanatics. They were teenagers and young men in their 20s who had been drafted into military service and given minimal training before being sent into combat against overwhelming opposition. Many understood they were going to die. Some wrote farewell letters to families before launching on missions they knew were suicidal. They flew anyway because their culture demanded it, because they had been taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, because refusing to fly meant shame for themselves and their families. These young men deserved better than to be sacrificed in a war their nation could not win by leaders who refused to acknowledge reality. The failure was not theirs. The failure belonged to the Japanese military and political leadership that had started a war without understanding their opponent's capabilities, that had designed training infrastructure inadequate for modern warfare's demands, and that refused to seek peace even after defeat became mathematically certain. The pilots who died at the Battle of the Philippine Sea were victims of tome for these failures. Similarly, the young Americans who fought on June 19th were products of their nation's choices. Most were volunteers who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, motivated by patriotism and desire to serve. They came from cities and farms across America. They represented every region and many ethnic backgrounds. What united them was the training framework that had transformed them from civilians into naval aviators capable of fighting and winning against determined opponents. These men were not naturally superior to their Japanese counterparts. They were not braver or more skilled by nature. They were better trained, better equipped, and sustained by a logistical and industrial machine that freed them to focus solely on flying and fighting, not on fuel shortages, ammunition counts, or mechanical failures. That framework built their advantage, and that same framework secured their victory. The now iconic photograph of Lieutenant Alexander Vasu, grinning broadly and holding up 6 fingers after his extraordinary combat feat, captured something fundamental about the American war effort. Vasu had every right to be proud. Downing 6 enemy planes in just 8 minutes demanded immense skill and composure. Yet his smile was not one of cruelty or triumph over fallen enemies. It was the expression of a young man who had done his duty well, defended his carrier and his comrades, and lived to see another dawn. His face showed confidence without arrogance, victory without hatred. The quiet satisfaction of professionalism. That single image says more about why America won the Pacific War than any tactical report or statistical summary ever could. American forces were confident because they had reason to be. They were backed by an industrial base Japan could not rival, trained through programs designed to produce skilled pilots in mass numbers, and armed with technology that gave them overwhelming advantages. They fought not from desperation or fanaticism, but from competence, methodical, disciplined, and backed by a war machine capable of sustaining them indefinitely. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not America's most important naval battle. That distinction still belongs to Midway, which halted Japan's expansion and reversed the war's momentum. But it was the most one-sided demonstration of American superiority, irrefutable proof that Japan no longer had the means to contest U.S. advances. It was the mathematical confirmation that continuing the war had become futile. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved that modern war favors nations capable of training thousands of good warriors over those who can train only dozens of elite ones. Japan's strategy was built on the ideal of quality, of the single decisive engagement won by skill and spirit. America's was built on quantity, on endurance, production, and sustained power. June 19, 1944, showed the world which philosophy fit the industrial age. Japanese leaders clung to the belief that spirit could triumph over material strength, that courage could overcome production, that a few years of brutal training could create warriors able to offset any numerical disadvantage. Those ideas, born from centuries of samurai tradition and early war success in China and the Pacific, crumbled in the face of industrial reality. The Marianas Battle exposed that illusion with mathematical precision. American industry, applied methodically to training and production, created a war-fighting capability that no amount of Japanese valor could match. The significance of the battle extended far beyond its immediate results. It showed Japan's leaders that the war was already lost. American carrier groups could operate across the Pacific with near impunity. U.S. air power would soon devastate Japanese cities. Submarines had already crippled Japan's shipping lanes. The industrial gap between the two nations, immense from the beginning, had become an unbridgeable abyss. Each passing month widened it further. Yet the war continued for another 14 months. Unable to accept defeat, Japan's leadership condemned the nation to a prolonged and hopeless defense that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The tragedy of the Philippine Sea was not only the thousands who died that day, but that their sacrifice achieved nothing. Japan failed to save Saipan, failed to slow the American advance, and failed to secure better terms for peace. The loss of over 600 aircraft and 3,000 sailors accomplished only one thing. It demonstrated how completely Japan had lost the capacity to wage modern war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea remains a testament to the decisive power of industrial capacity in the modern age. Japan's defeat was not predetermined at Pearl Harbor, but it became inevitable when its leaders failed to build the infrastructure needed to sustain prolonged warfare. The Turkey Shoot was merely the moment when arithmetic caught up with ideology, when the chasm between American and Japanese capability became too vast to ignore. For students of military history, the battle offers enduring lessons. Training outweighs courage. Industry outweighs tradition. Technology outweighs spirit. Integration and coordination outweigh isolated brilliance. Nations that grasp these truths and align their societies around them will prevail in modern conflict. Those that rely on heroism and willpower to overcome material weakness will fall. The evidence is overwhelming, and the results decisive. The strategies guiding both sides revealed this divide clearly. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet operated under firm priorities: protect the Saipan invasion, destroy Japanese naval air power, and sink enemy carriers if possible, but never at the expense of the first two. Even when aggressive subordinates urged pursuit on the night of June 19th, Spruance refused to abandon his principles. He understood that his duty was to safeguard the invasion forces, not to gamble them in a night chase into uncertain waters. Japanese planning told a different story. Operation Ago rested on the same old faith in the decisive battle. If carrier and land-based aircraft could coordinate to strike simultaneously, perhaps the Americans could be driven from the Marianas. But the plan required perfect timing, flawless communication, and pilots capable of navigating and attacking under heavy fire, none of which Japan possessed by June 1944. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decision to launch long-range strikes reflected misplaced confidence in the legendary range of the Zero. On paper, Japanese planes could strike farther than American ones. In reality, range meant nothing without skilled pilots. Many aircraft that survived the attacks never made it home, lost to poor navigation, fuel exhaustion, or simple disorientation. American doctrine, by contrast, emphasized fuel discipline and conservative strike ranges. U.S. pilots could fight hard and still have the fuel to return, refuel, and rejoin the battle. The difference between American operational efficiency and Japanese desperation could not have been clearer. Technology widened the gap further. American radar detected incoming raids over 100 miles out. Fighter directors guided interceptors with precision, while carrier-to-carrier and ship-to-air communications allowed real-time coordination. Japan possessed radar too, but lacked the doctrine, training, and infrastructure to use it effectively. The Philippine Sea proved that modern naval warfare demanded excellence across every dimension. Air power, submarines, surface fleets, logistics, intelligence, and training, all bound by technological sophistication and industrial depth. Victory required balance, not brilliance in isolation. America had achieved that balance. Japan had not. The lessons were immediate and lasting. The battle cemented carrier aviation as the new core of naval power. Battleships, once symbols of might, were reduced to escorts and bombardment platforms. Air power ruled the seas, but only for nations capable of producing the pilots, planes, and fuel to sustain it. Japan's leaders had misunderstood this truth. They believed superior pilots and a handful of elite carriers could offset American numbers. They were catastrophically wrong. The Hellcat outmatched the Zero. American carriers outnumbered Japanese ones several times over. American training produced competence in thousands, not brilliance in dozens. Every Japanese assumption collapsed on June 19, 1944. And in that collapse, the world saw the future of warfare. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a battle. It was the turning point where modern war's equation became clear. It showed that courage, however great, cannot substitute for production. That spirit cannot outfly steel. That the age of the individual warrior had ended, and the age of the industrial soldier had begun.